The scream that tore from Katherine Aldridge's throat echoed across the empty Arizona desert as her mare collapsed beneath her, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die out here alone. The November sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly despite the approaching winter, and Katherine felt panic grip her chest as she scrambled away from her horse. Daisy lay on her side, her right front leg bent at an unnatural angle, eyes rolling white with pain and terror. Katherine's hands shook as she approached the animal that had been her companion for 3 years, her only means of survival in this unforgiving landscape 15 miles from Globe, Arizona. "No, no, no," Katherine whispered, tears streaming down her dust-covered face as she knelt beside Daisy. The mare's leg was clearly broken, and Katherine knew what that meant even as her mind refused to accept it. She had no gun, no way to end the animal's suffering, and no way to get home. Her canteen held perhaps 2 more swallows of water, and the November desert, though cooler than summer, could still kill a person foolish enough to be caught unprepared. Katherine had been visiting the Henderson Ranch to deliver correspondence from her father's general store when the accident happened. Daisy had stepped wrong in a hidden gopher hole, and now Katherine was stranded with a dying horse, minimal supplies, and the very real possibility that she would never see her family again. At 22 years old, she had survived the journey west with her parents 5 years ago, survived her mother's death from fever 2 years past, and helped her father build a thriving business in Globe. She had not survived all that just to die alone in the desert. The sound of hoofbeats made Katherine's head snap up, her heart hammering between hope and fear. A lone rider could be salvation or doom in this territory where Apache raids still occurred and outlaws roamed freely. She shaded her eyes against the sun and watched as a massive figure on horseback approached from the north, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh land. As the rider drew closer, Katherine could make out more details. The man was enormous, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle, sitting astride a large roan stallion that looked capable of carrying his substantial frame with ease. He wore buckskin clothing, weathered and practical, and his dark hair hung past his shoulders, held back with a leather cord. A full beard covered the lower half of his face, and even from a distance, Katherine could see the careful way he surveyed the situation before approaching. "Easy there," the man called out, his voice deep and resonant. "I mean no harm, miss. Saw you from the ridge and figured something was wrong." Katherine stood slowly, very aware of how vulnerable she was. Her practical split riding skirt was covered in dust, her white blouse stained with sweat, and her blonde hair had come loose from its pins to hang in disarray around her shoulders. "My horse," she said, her voice breaking. "Her leg is broken." The man dismounted with fluid grace despite his size, and Katherine took an involuntary step back. He had to be at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His arms were thick with muscle, visible even through his buckskin shirt, and his hands looked large enough to snap a man's neck without effort. But his eyes, a startling blue-gray beneath dark brows, held only concern as he approached the injured mare. "Name's Yates Younger," he said quietly, kneeling beside Daisy with surprising gentleness. His large hands moved expertly over the horse's leg, and he shook his head grimly. "I'm sorry, miss. There's nothing to be done for her." "I know," Katherine whispered, fresh tears spilling over. "But I have no way to help her, and I cannot just leave her to suffer." Yates stood, his expression grave. "I can help her pass easy if you want to say your goodbyes. Then I will see you home safe. Where are you headed?" "Globe," Katherine said, watching as he pulled a pistol from his belt with practiced ease. "But that is 15 miles from here, and I cannot ask you to walk that distance." "You're not asking," Yates said simply. "I am offering. Now, say your piece to your mare. This is not something you should watch." Katherine knelt beside Daisy one last time, pressing her face against the horse's neck and breathing in her familiar scent. "I am so sorry, girl," she whispered. "Thank you for taking care of me. Go easy now." She stood and walked several yards away, her back turned, when the single gunshot cracked through the air. Katherine flinched, her hands covering her face as she wept for her faithful companion. She did not hear Yates approach, but suddenly his presence was beside her, not touching, but offering silent comfort. "I am sorry for your loss," he said after a long moment. "A good horse is a true friend." Katherine wiped her eyes and turned to face him, really looking at him for the first time. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors, the scar that traced along his left jaw, and the intelligence in his gaze that contradicted the rough mountain man appearance. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two older, and there was something fundamentally solid about him, as if he were carved from the same stone as the mountains he clearly called home. "Thank you," she managed. "I am Katherine Aldridge. My father runs the general store in Globe." "I know the place," Yates said with a slight nod. "Good man, your father. Fair prices and honest dealing. Come on, Miss Aldridge, let me get you home." He walked to his roan stallion and began untying his bedroll and saddlebags. Katherine watched in confusion as he removed his supplies and set them on the ground, then led the horse over to her. "What are you doing?" she asked. "You will ride? I will walk," Yates said matter-of-factly, as if this were the most obvious solution in the world. "It is too far for you to walk in those boots, and the desert is no place to be caught after dark." "But your horse, your supplies," Katherine protested. "I cannot ask you to do this." "You are not asking," Yates repeated, a hint of amusement coloring his serious expression. "I am choosing. Now, do you need help mounting up, or can you manage?" Katherine felt her throat tighten with emotion at this stranger's casual kindness. "I can manage," she said quietly, "but I do not even know how to thank you properly." "Getting home safe is thanks enough," Yates said. He held the reins steady as Katherine pulled herself into the saddle. The stirrups were far too long for her shorter legs, but before she could say anything, Yates was already adjusting them with quick, efficient movements. His hands never touched her inappropriately, remaining strictly professional despite their proximity. "What's his name?" Katherine asked, patting the stallion's powerful neck. "That is Ranger," Yates said, gathering his supplies into a bundle he could carry. "He is trail-smart and even-tempered. He will take care of you." They set out toward Globe, Yates walking beside Ranger with a long, steady stride that seemed like he could maintain it forever. Katherine felt guilty watching him walk in the heat while she rode, but when she suggested they take turns, he dismissed the idea immediately. "I have walked further in worse conditions," he said. "Besides, I know every inch of this territory. Walking gives me time to watch for trouble." "Do you live in the mountains?" Katherine asked, curious about this man who had appeared like an answer to prayer. "Most of the time," Yates confirmed. "I have a cabin about 20 miles north of Globe up in the high country. I trap and hunt, bring furs and meat to town a few times a year. Was headed that way when I saw you." "So you live alone?" The question came out before Katherine could stop it, and she felt her face flush. "Forgive me, that was too personal." "Nothing to forgive," Yates said easily. "And yes, mostly alone. Had a partner for a while, but he moved on to Colorado 2 years back. I prefer the solitude. People can be more dangerous than bears if you are not careful." Katherine studied his profile as they walked, noting the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, always alert. "Have you always lived in Arizona?" "No, miss. Came out here after the war. Saw too much fighting, too much death. The mountains were quiet, and that suited me just fine." The weight in his voice told Katherine not to press further on that subject. Instead, she asked about the land, and Yates proved surprisingly articulate about the desert ecosystem, pointing out tracks and plants, explaining which were useful and which were dangerous. You know this land well," Katherine observed after he identified a spot where a mountain lion had passed recently. "A man has to know the land if he wants to survive in it," Yates replied. "The desert will kill you quick if you do not respect it. How did you end up so far from town without more supplies?" Katherine explained her errand to the Henderson Ranch, how she had planned to be back before dark but had taken a shortcut on the return journey. "I thought I knew this area well enough," she admitted. "I was foolish." "Not foolish," Yates said, glancing up at her. "Unlucky. There's a difference. You could not have known about that gopher hole any more than your mare could. Sometimes bad things just happen." His words were oddly comforting, and Katherine found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. As they walked, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Yates maintained his steady pace, never showing signs of fatigue even as the miles passed beneath his boots. "Tell me about your store," Yates said after a long stretch of comfortable silence. "Your father runs it, but do you work there too?" "I do," Katherine confirmed, After my mother passed, it became just the two of us. I help with everything from inventory to sales to bookkeeping. Father always said I have a head for numbers. It is a good skill to have, Yates said. Better than most. What about you? Katherine asked. Did you have family back east before the war? Yates was quiet for so long that Katherine thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully neutral. Had parents, 2 brothers. Lost one brother at Gettysburg, the other to cholera right after the war ended. Parents died of heartbreak within a year of each other. There was nothing left to go home to, so I kept moving west until I found a place that felt right. I'm so sorry, Katherine said softly, understanding now the loneliness that must drive a man to choose solitude in the mountains. That is a terrible loss. It was a long time ago, Yates said, but Katherine could hear the thread of old pain beneath the words. We all carry our ghosts, Miss Aldridge. The mountains help me keep mine quiet. They walked on as the sun sank lower, and Katherine began to recognize landmarks that told her they were getting closer to Globe. Her father would be frantic with worry by now, and she felt guilty for the anxiety she must be causing him. We will make it before full dark, Yates said, as if reading her thoughts. Another hour, maybe less. My father will want to reward you, Katherine said, for helping me, for walking all this way. No reward necessary, Yates said firmly. Any decent man would have done the same. But Katherine suspected that was not entirely true. She had heard stories of women left to fend for themselves in the territory, of men who took advantage of vulnerable situations. Yates Younger could have robbed her, hurt her, or simply ridden past entirely, and no one would have known or blamed him. Instead, he had given up his horse and supplies to walk beside her for 15 miles, asking nothing in return. As Globe came into view in the fading light, Katherine felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. She had enjoyed talking with Yates, had felt safer with him than she had any right to feel with a stranger. There was something fundamentally good about him, something solid and trustworthy that existed beneath the rough exterior. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with businesses and houses spreading out from the center. Aldridge General Store stood near the middle of town, a sturdy wooden building with large windows and a painted sign. As they approached, the door burst open and Katherine's father came running out. Katherine! James Aldridge was a lean man in his 50s with gray hair and worried eyes that filled with relief at the sight of his daughter. Thank God, I was about to organize a search party. I'm fine, Father, Katherine said, dismounting from Ranger with Yates's steadying hand at her elbow. But Daisy broke her leg, and I would not have made it home if not for Mr. Younger here. James turned to Yates with an expression of profound gratitude. You have my deepest thanks, sir. Please come inside. You must be exhausted and hungry. It is the least I can do. I appreciate the offer, Yates said, but I should be getting back. I have a long walk ahead of me still. Nonsense, James said firmly. You walked my daughter 15 miles home. The sun is setting, and you are not walking into the dark without a meal in your belly and a chance to rest. I insist. Katherine watched Yates hesitate, clearly uncomfortable with the attention and gratitude. But James Aldridge was not a man easily dissuaded when he had made up his mind, and eventually, Yates nodded his acceptance. Just for a meal, he said. Then I need to head out. The interior of the store was exactly what Yates had expected. Well organized, clean, and stocked with everything from foodstuffs to tools to fabric. Stairs at the back led to the living quarters above, and James ushered them both upstairs to a comfortable parlor and kitchen area. Sit, please, James insisted, pointing Yates to a sturdy chair at the dining table. Katherine, help me get some food together. Mr. Younger, there's water in the basin if you want to wash up. Yates nodded his thanks, feeling distinctly out of place in the civilized surroundings. His buckskin clothing, weathered and dusty from the trail, seemed to belong to a different world than the tidy domestic space around him. He washed his hands and face in the basin, then sat at the table as instructed, watching as Katherine and her father moved efficiently around the kitchen. James peppered him with questions as they prepared the meal, wanting to know exactly what had happened and how far Yates had walked. Katherine filled in details, her voice warm as she described Yates' kindness and the way he had handled the difficult situation with Daisy. You are a good man, Yates Younger, James said seriously, setting a plate of roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables in front of him. There are not enough men like you in this world. I just did what anyone would do, Yates said, uncomfortable with the praise. That is where you are wrong, James said. Not everyone would have stopped to help. Not everyone would have given up their horse and walked beside a stranger for 15 miles. You saved my daughter's life today, and I will not forget it. The meal was excellent, better than anything Yates had eaten in months, and he found himself relaxing slightly as they talked. Katherine had changed into a clean blue dress and repinned her hair, and Yates tried not to notice how the lamplight brought out the gold in her blonde locks, or how her hazel eyes seemed to reflect every emotion that crossed her face. Do you come to town often? Katherine asked, refilling his coffee cup. Few times a year, Yates said. Usually in spring and fall to trade furs, then again before winter to stock up on supplies I cannot make or hunt myself. So we might see you again soon? There was something almost hopeful in Katherine's voice that made Yates's chest tighten. Perhaps, he said carefully. I will need to come back for Ranger once I return to my cabin. Cannot exactly walk him 20 miles and then walk 20 more back home tonight. Then it is settled, James said. You will stay here tonight, rest and head home in the morning. We have a spare room, and you are more than welcome to use it. Yates wanted to protest, but the practical part of his mind recognized the wisdom in the offer. Walking another 20 miles in the dark after the day he had already had would be foolish, and he had not survived 10 years in the mountains by being foolish. I appreciate it, he said finally. Thank you. The spare room was small but comfortable, with a real bed and clean linens that felt impossibly luxurious after years of sleeping on a thin bedroll. Yates lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Katherine Aldridge. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was intelligent and kind, with a quiet strength that had carried her through losing her mother and building a life in this harsh territory. But Yates had chosen his path years ago when he left civilization behind for the solitude of the mountains. He had nothing to offer a woman like Katherine, no home except a rough cabin, no life except the lonely existence of a mountain man. It would be selfish to entertain any thoughts beyond gratitude for her hospitality. Still, as he finally drifted off to sleep, it was Katherine's face he saw in his mind, the way she had looked at him with such trust and warmth as they made their way to Globe. Morning came too quickly, and Yates woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen. He washed, dressed, and headed downstairs to find Katherine already awake and preparing breakfast, while her father organized the store below for opening. Good morning, Katherine said, smiling at him with a brightness that made something in Yates's chest ache. Did you sleep well? Better than I have in years, Yates admitted. Thank you again for your hospitality. It is we who should be thanking you, Katherine said, setting a plate before him. Father and I talked last night, and we want you to know that you are always welcome here. Anytime you come to town, you have a place to stay and a warm meal waiting. The offer touched Yates more deeply than he wanted to admit. That's very kind of you, Miss Aldridge. Katherine, she corrected gently. After everything, I think we can dispense with formalities, do you not think? Then you should call me Yates, he said, meeting her eyes. For a moment, something passed between them, a connection that felt both unexpected and inevitable. James came upstairs as they were finishing breakfast. Already holding supplies he insisted on giving Yates for his journey home. Coffee, bacon, flour, dried beans, he listed, adding items to a canvas sack. And please, take this as well. He held out a roll of bills that made Yates shake his head immediately. I cannot take your money, James. I did not help Katherine for payment. I know that, James said, which is exactly why I want you to have it, not as payment, but as gratitude. Let me do this, Yates. Let me thank you properly for bringing my daughter home safe. Yates recognized the same determination in James's eyes that he had seen in Katherine's, and he knew arguing would be pointless. You are too generous, he said, accepting the money with reluctance. But thank you. Katherine walked him down to the street where Ranger waited, already saddled and ready. The town was coming alive around them, people heading to work and opening shops for the day's business. Several curious looks were directed their way, and Yates knew the story of Katherine's rescue would be all over Globe by noon. Thank you again, Katherine said softly, one hand resting on Ranger's neck. For everything. I hope you will come back to visit when you are next in town. I will, Yates promised, surprised by how much he meant it. He wanted to say more, to acknowledge the strange pull he felt toward this woman he barely knew, but the words would not come. Instead, He touched his hand to his hat in farewell, mounted Ranger, and rode north toward the mountains, feeling Katherine's eyes on him the entire way. The 20 miles back to his cabin passed in a blur of thoughts. Yates tried to focus on the familiar landscape, on the practical concerns of checking his trap lines and preparing for winter, but his mind kept returning to Katherine. The way she had remained calm even when faced with her horse's injury and her own potential death. The intelligence in her eyes when she spoke about running the store. The kindness in her voice when she thanked him. His cabin, when he finally reached it, felt emptier than it ever had before. The single room with its stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and minimal comforts had been enough for him for years. Now, suddenly, it felt less like peaceful solitude and more like simple loneliness. Yates spent the next week trying to shake the feeling. He checked his trap lines, repaired a section of roof that had been damaged in a storm, and hunted enough meat to see him through the coming months. The physical work usually brought him peace, but this time it only gave him more time to think. He thought about Katherine constantly, the sound of her laugh when he had told a story about a run-in with a confused bear, the way she had cried for her horse, showing compassion even in the face of her own danger, the trust in her eyes as she accepted his help without question or fear. 10 days after leaving Globe, Yates found himself packing Ranger's saddlebags with furs he had cured earlier in the season. It was too early for his usual trading trip, and he knew it, but he justified it by telling himself he needed additional supplies for winter. The fact that those supplies could easily wait another month was something he chose not to examine too closely. Globe looked exactly the same as it had 10 days earlier, but somehow everything felt different as Yates rode down the main street toward Aldridge General Store. It was mid-afternoon, and through the large windows he could see Katherine helping a customer while James worked behind the counter. Katherine looked up as the door opened, and her face transformed with a smile so genuine and delighted that Yates felt his resolve to keep his distance crumble like dry adobe in a storm. "Yates," she said, her voice full of warmth, "I did not expect to see you again so soon." "Had some furs to trade," Yates said, suddenly feeling awkward and uncertain. "Figured I would bring them in before the weather turns." James came around the counter, his expression knowing. "Always happy to take good furs off your hands. Katherine, why do not you show Yates what came in on yesterday's supply wagon while I sort through these pelts?" Katherine's smile turned slightly mischievous, as if she saw right through her father's transparent excuse to leave them alone. "Of course, Father. Yates, come see the new stock. I think you will find some of it interesting." She led him through the store, pointing out new tools and supplies, and Yates found himself more interested in watching her talk than in the actual merchandise. The way her hands moved as she described items, the enthusiasm in her voice when she showed him a new type of lantern that burned cleaner than the old models, the quick intelligence with which she calculated prices and compared quality. "I'm glad you came back," Katherine said finally, stopping near a display of fabric that she was clearly reorganizing. "I have thought about you often since you left." The admission was bold, especially for a respectable woman, and Yates felt his heart rate pick up. "I have thought about you too," he said honestly, "more than I probably should." Katherine met his eyes directly, and Yates saw his own confusion reflected there, the same push and pull between attraction and practicality. "Why should you not think about me?" she asked softly. "Because I live in a cabin in the mountains, 20 miles from anywhere," Yates said. "I have nothing to offer except a hard life and uncertain future. You deserve better than that." "Should I not be the judge of what I deserve?" Katherine asked, a hint of steel beneath her gentle tone. "I am not a child, Yates. I'm a grown woman who knows her own mind." Before Yates could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices and the sound of horses being ridden too hard through town sent both of them to the door. A group of rough-looking men were dismounting in front of the saloon across the street, their clothing dusty from hard travel and their manner aggressive. "Trouble," James said quietly, coming to stand beside Yates. "Those are some of the Fletcher boys and their gang. They have been causing problems throughout the territory, and there have been rumors they might be headed this way." Yates assessed the group with the practiced eye of someone who had seen more than his share of dangerous men. 6 of them total, all armed, all looking for trouble. The apparent leader was a tall man with a cruel face and cold eyes that swept the street as if cataloging potential targets. Everyone stay inside, Yates said quietly. Do not give them any reason to notice this place. But it was too late. One of the men, younger than the others and clearly already deep in drink despite the early hour, had spotted Katherine through the window. He said something to his companions that made them laugh, and then the group started moving toward the store. Get upstairs, James told Katherine urgently. Now. Father. Katherine started to protest. Now? James repeated, his voice firm in a way that brooked no argument. Katherine looked between her father and Yates, then nodded and quickly headed for the stairs. Yates moved to stand beside James behind the counter, positioning himself where he could reach the rifle he knew James kept within easy reach. The door opened and 3 of the men entered, bringing with them the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. The young one, who had spotted Katherine, looked around with bleary, aggressive eyes. Afternoon, gentlemen, James said with forced politeness. How can I help you? Saw a pretty blonde through your window, the young man slurred. Want to meet her? My daughter is retired for the day, James said evenly, but I can help you with any supplies you might need. The young man's face darkened. I said I want to meet your daughter. You calling me a liar? Nobody's calling anyone anything, Yates said, his deep voice carrying a weight of authority that made the drunk man focus on him for the first time. The lady is not available. Find what you need or move along. One of the other men, older and more sober, grabbed the young drunk by the arm. Come on, Billy, this is not worth it. We have business to attend to. But Billy shook off his companion's grip, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. You telling me what to do, mountain man. Maybe I do not like being told what to do. Yates remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on Billy's face. He had seen this play out 100 times during the war and after, young men full of false courage from drink and eager to prove themselves. The key was to defuse the situation before violence became inevitable. I am suggesting that you think carefully about your next move, Yates said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. Because once you draw that pistol, there is no going back. Is seeing a woman you do not know really worth dying over? The words hung in the air, and Yates watched as the calculation played out behind Billy's eyes. The other men had gone very still, and Yates knew they were weighing their own odds. 6 against 2 should have been easy numbers, but there was something about Yates's complete confidence that gave them pause. Billy, we are leaving, the older man said firmly. Boss said no trouble in town, and I am not going to be the one to explain why you got yourself killed over a store clerk's daughter. For a long moment, Yates thought Billy might do something stupid anyway. Then, slowly, the young man's hand moved away from his gun. This is not over, he muttered, trying to salvage some pride. Yes, it is, Yates said simply, and something in his tone made it clear that any further conversation on the subject would end badly. The 3 men left, Billy being practically dragged by his companions. Through the window, Yates watched as they rejoined their group and mounted up, riding out of town to the west. The entire encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but Yates could feel the adrenaline still coursing through his system. Thank you, James said quietly. That could have gone very badly. It still might, Yates said grimly. Men like that do not forget being challenged, especially in front of their friends. You need to be careful, James. Katherine, too. Katherine came down the stairs, her face pale but composed. Are they gone? For now, Yates said. But they might come back. Do you have somewhere else you can stay for a few days, friends or family outside of town? I'm not leaving my father alone to face those men if they return, Katherine said firmly. And I'm not leaving my store and home, James added. This is our life, Yates. We cannot run every time trouble appears. Yates wanted to argue, to make them see reason, but he understood their position. This was their home, their livelihood, and abandoning it was not a simple matter. He looked at Katherine, seeing the determination in her eyes, and made a decision he knew he might regret. Then I am staying too, he said, at least until we know those men have moved on for good. Yates, you do not have to do that, Katherine protested. We cannot ask you to. You are not asking, Yates interrupted, echoing the words he had spoken days earlier in the desert. I am choosing. If you will have me, I will stay here until I know you are both safe. The relief on both their faces told Yates he had made the right choice, even as the practical part of his mind questioned what he was doing. He had come to town to see Katherine again, yes, but he had not planned on inserting himself into her life so completely. Yet now that the decision was made, it felt right in a way he could not quite explain. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Yates spent his time around the store, helping James with heavy lifting and repairs while keeping a watchful eye out for trouble. There had been no sign of the Fletcher gang since their confrontation, but Yates remained cautious. Men like that were unpredictable, and the fact that they had not yet left the area worried him. Working in the store brought Yates into close contact with Katherine, and he found himself enjoying the domestic rhythm of it all. She was a natural at dealing with customers, patient with the difficult ones, and warm with the friendly ones. She knew the inventory better than her own father did, and could calculate complicated orders in her head faster than Yates could follow. In the evenings, after the store closed, the three of them would have dinner together upstairs. Yates found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing stories of his time in the mountains and before that, his life back east. Katherine and James were easy company, their obvious love for each other reminding Yates painfully of what he had lost when his own family died. "You should have been a teacher," Katherine said one evening after Yates had described the different types of pine trees in the high country and their various uses. "You explained things so clearly." "Never had the patience for teaching," Yates said with a slight smile. "Trees do not talk back." "I do not know," James said with a laugh. "Katherine could make a tree talk back if she set her mind to it." Katherine threw a dish towel at her father, laughing, and Yates felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the sight. This was what family looked like, what home felt like, and he had not realized how much he had missed it until now. Later, after James had gone to bed, Yates found Katherine on the small balcony that overlooked the street. She was wrapped in a shawl against the cool November evening, staring up at the stars. "Cannot sleep?" Yates asked, stepping out to join her. "Too much thinking," Katherine admitted. "Yates, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," he said. "I may not answer, but you can ask." Katherine turned to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Why do you really live alone in the mountains? I understand that you lost your family, and I am deeply sorry for that. But most men who lose their families either start new ones, or at least live where they can be around other people. You have chosen total isolation. Why?" It was the question Yates had been avoiding, both from Katherine and from himself. He looked out over the quiet street, searching for the right words. "During the war, I did things I am not proud of," he said finally. "Nothing dishonorable, you understand, but war makes killers of us all. I saw friends die, killed men who were just following orders like I was, and by the end of it all, I could not stand to be around people anymore. The noise, the crowds, the constant demands, it all felt suffocating." He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he had never put into words before. "In the mountains, there is a simplicity to everything. Hunt to eat, build shelter to stay warm, watch for danger to stay alive. No lies, no false kindness, no one pretending to care when they really just want something from you. Just honest survival." Katherine was quiet for a long moment, digesting his words. "That sounds very lonely," she said softly. It is," Yates admitted, "but loneliness is safer than disappointment. I cannot be let down by people if there are no people around to let me down." "Is that really living, though?" Katherine asked. "Or is it just surviving? There is a difference, you know." Her words struck something deep inside Yates, a truth he had been avoiding for years. Before he could respond, Katherine continued. "I lost my mother 2 years ago to fever," she said. "For months after, I wondered what the point was of caring about anyone when they could be taken away so suddenly. I thought about closing myself off, protecting myself from ever hurting like that again." "What changed?" Yates asked. "My father," Katherine said simply. "One day he found me crying in the stockroom, and he said something I will never forget. He told me that loving someone, even knowing you might lose them, is what makes us human. That the pain of loss is just proof that we were brave enough to care in the first place." She turned to face Yates fully, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You have been hurt, Yates. I understand that. But hiding in the mountains for the rest of your life is not healing. It is just a different kind of dying." The truth in her words hit Yates like a physical blow. He stared at Katherine, this brave, insightful woman who saw through his carefully constructed defenses to the wounded man beneath and felt something shift inside him. "You are right," he said quietly, "and that terrifies me." Katherine reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. Being brave means doing things even when they terrify you. You walked 15 miles beside me in the desert without hesitation. Show that same courage now. Yates looked down at their joined hands, rough mountain-weathered skin against soft storekeeper's daughter fingers, and felt the walls he had spent years building start to crumble. "I do not know how," he admitted. "It has been so long since I tried to be part of anything beyond my own survival." "Start small," Katherine said. "Start by admitting that you want more than just surviving." Yates met her eyes, seeing hope and warmth and something that might have been love beginning to grow there. "I want more," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you." The words hung between them, honest and raw, and Katherine's face transformed with a smile that made Yates's heart race. She stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. "I want you too," she whispered. "From the moment I saw you riding toward me in the desert, something just felt right. I cannot explain it better than that." Yates raised his free hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "You deserve someone who can give you a good life, Katherine. I am a mountain man with nothing to offer but a rough cabin and uncertain future." "You are a good man with a kind heart and strong hands," Katherine countered. "You are intelligent and brave and honest. That is more than most women ever find, regardless of what kind of cabin comes with it." Yates leaned down slowly, giving Katherine every chance to pull away, but she only tilted her face up to meet him. Their lips touched softly at first, a gentle exploration that sent warmth flooding through Yates's entire body. He deepened the kiss, one hand tangling in Katherine's hair while the other pulled her closer, and she responded with equal passion, her arms wrapping around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against Katherine's. "I have not kissed anyone in over 10 years, he admitted. Katherine laughed softly. "Well, you have not forgotten how." They stood together on the balcony for a long time, holding each other and talking quietly about everything and nothing. Yates told her more about his life in the mountains, the things he loved about the solitude, and the things he'd begun to realize he missed. Katherine talked about running the store, her dreams of maybe expanding it one day, her fear of ending up alone like so many women did in this harsh territory. I do not want to live in town," Yates said finally, needing to be honest about his limitations. "I cannot, Katherine. Too many years away from people, and I would go mad within a month." "I am not asking you to," Katherine said, "but could you see yourself living in the mountains with someone else? With me?" The question hung between them, enormous in its implications. Yates thought about his cabin, imagined Katherine there with him, and felt something like hope bloom in his chest. "The cabin is rough," he warned. "One room, no luxuries, hard work every day just to survive." "I grew up in a wagon crossing the plains," Katherine reminded him. "Rough does not scare me. What scares me is spending my life wondering what might have been if I was too afraid to take a chance." Yates kissed her again, softer this time, and whispered against her lips, "Then yes. Yes, I can see myself sharing my life with you. I want to try." They talked late into the night, making tentative plans and acknowledging obstacles. Katherine would need to discuss everything with her father, and Yates would need to prepare his cabin for a second occupant. There were practical concerns about supplies and the coming winter, questions about whether Katherine would be happy so far from town and the store she loved. But underneath all the practical concerns, there was a growing certainty that this was right, that they had found something rare and worth fighting for. The next morning, Yates sat down with James to have what felt like the most important conversation of his life. To his surprise, James smiled before Yates had even finished explaining his intentions toward Katherine. "I was wondering how long it would take you to come talk to me," James said. "I have eyes, Yates. I have seen the way you two look at each other." "I want to marry her," Yates said directly. "But I need you to understand what that means. I live in the mountains, James. I cannot give Katherine the life she has here in town." James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "My daughter is not a woman who needs comfort and luxury to be happy," he said finally. She needs someone who will love her, protect her, and treat her as an equal partner. From what I have seen, you can give her all those things. She would be 20 miles from town, from you, from the store, Yates continued, needing James to understand the full reality. It would be a hard life. Life is hard everywhere, James said. At least in the mountains with you, she would be with someone who values her for who she is. Do you love her, Yates? The question caught Yates off guard. He had been focusing so much on the practical aspects that he had not stopped to name what he was feeling. But as soon as James asked, Yates knew the answer. Yes, he said simply. I know it is fast, and I know it seems impossible. But yes, I love her. James reached across the table and gripped Yates's shoulder. Then you have my blessing. But you need to promise me something. Promise me that if Katherine ever wants to come back to town, if mountain life proves too hard or too lonely, you will not stop her. You will not make her choose between her happiness and staying with you. I promise, Yates said without hesitation. Katherine's happiness will always come before my own comfort, always. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from downstairs. Yates and James both rushed down to find Katherine at the window, her face pale as she pointed up the street. They are back, she said, the Fletcher gang, and they brought more men this time. Yates looked out to see at least a dozen riders coming down the main street, Billy Fletcher prominent among them. His stomach sank as he realized what this meant. Billy had not forgotten their confrontation, and he had brought reinforcements. James, take Katherine out the back, Yates said urgently. Go to the marshal's office and stay there. I am not leaving you alone to face them, James said firmly. And I'm certainly not running away while you two play hero, Katherine added, crossing her arms. Yates wanted to argue, but there was no time. The riders were already stopping in front of the store, and this time their intention was clear. They wanted trouble, and they were going to get it one way or another. The door slammed open and Billy Fletcher strode in, backed by 4 of his men. He was sober this time, which somehow made him more dangerous. His eyes locked on Yates with undisguised hostility. Thought maybe you left town, Billy said. But here you are, still playing protector for the pretty store girl. What do you want, Fletcher? Yates asked, positioning himself between Billy and Katherine. An apology, Billy said. You embarrassed me in front of my men, made me look weak. I think you owe me for that. I am not apologizing for keeping you from making a mistake, Yates said calmly. Now, if you have business here, conduct it and leave. Otherwise, move along. Billy's face darkened with anger. You do not give me orders, mountain man. Maybe I should teach you some respect. His hand dropped to his gun, and Yates tensed, ready to move. But before either of them could act, the door opened again and the marshal walked in, followed by 3 deputies. Marshal Tom Garrett was an older man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence to be impressed by posturing. Heard you boys were back in town, Garrett said casually, his hand resting on his own gun. Thought I would come make sure you understood our rules here. No fighting, no intimidation, no troublemaking of any kind. Break those rules, and you will find yourself in a cell. Are we clear? Billy looked between the marshal and Yates, clearly weighing his options. Finally, with visible effort, he stepped back. Crystal clear, Marshal. My boys and I were just leaving anyway. Good choice, Garrett said. And Billy, do not come back. Globe does not want your kind here. The Fletcher gang filed out, Billy shooting one last venomous look at Yates before mounting up and riding out of town. The tension in the store remained even after they left, everyone aware of how close things had come to violence. Thank you, Marshal, James said with genuine relief. Do not thank me yet, Garrett said grimly. Those boys are trouble, and trouble has a way of coming back around. They have been hitting small ranches and isolated homesteads throughout the territory. So far nobody has been killed, but it is only a matter of time. He turned to Yates. Word is you handled yourself well in there the other day. You have military experience? Yes, sir, Yates confirmed. Infantry during the war. Then you know how men like Billy think. He's going to see this as another embarrassment, which means he might be back with even more men next time, or he might decide to hit you where you're more vulnerable. Garrett's eyes moved to Katherine, his meaning clear. I'm taking Katherine out of town, Yates said, making the decision in that moment, somewhere they cannot find her easily. Your cabin, Garrett guessed. Yes, Will you keep an eye on James in the store? I will, Garrett promised. But Yates, those mountains are big and isolated. If the Fletcher gang decides to come after you there, help will not be able to reach you in time. I know, Yates said grimly, but I can defend a single cabin better than I can defend a store in the middle of town with innocent people around. Katherine grabbed Yates's arm. Wait, you're not making this decision without me. This is my life too. Yates turned to her, his expression serious. Katherine, I need you to trust me on this. If Fletcher comes back with his full gang looking for revenge, people could get hurt. Innocent people. I cannot let that happen. So your solution is to make yourself a target, Katherine demanded. My solution is to remove you from the line of fire, Yates corrected. If you are at my cabin, Fletcher would have to find us first, then make the journey into dangerous territory with uncertain outcome. It is a deterrent. James spoke up, his voice heavy with concern. He is right, Katherine. As much as I hate to admit it, you would be safer in the mountains with Yates than here in town where Fletcher knows where to find you. Katherine looked between the two men in her life, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, she nodded. All right, but I'm not hiding forever. If Fletcher does not leave the territory soon, we need to find another solution. Agreed, Yates said. Now, pack what you need. We leave within the hour. The next hour was a flurry of activity. Katherine packed clothing and personal items, while Yates and James gathered supplies for an extended stay in the mountains. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, extra blankets, everything they might need if they had to remain isolated for weeks. As Yates loaded supplies onto Ranger, James pulled him aside one last time. Take care of her, he said quietly. She is all I have left. I will protect her with my life, Yates promised. I swear it. James nodded, then handed Yates a small box. Inside was a delicate gold ring set with a small diamond. This was my wife's engagement ring. If you are serious about marrying Katherine, she should have it. Yates felt his throat tighten with emotion. James, I cannot. You can and you will, James said firmly. My wife would have liked you, Yates. She would have wanted Katherine to have someone strong and good to build a life with. Take it. Make my daughter happy. Yates carefully pocketed the ring, then gripped James's hand in a firm shake that turned into a brief, hard embrace. Thank you for everything. Katherine emerged from the store, carrying a bag and wearing practical traveling clothes. She hugged her father tightly, both of them fighting back tears. I will be fine, Father, and I will send word as soon as it is safe. I know you will, James said, kissing her forehead. You are stronger than your mother and I ever gave you credit for. Go. Build a good life. The ride out of town was tense, Yates constantly watching their surroundings for any sign of trouble. Katherine rode behind him on Ranger, her arms wrapped around his waist, and despite the circumstances, Yates felt a rightness to having her there with him. The journey to his cabin took most of the day, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as they climbed into the high country. Katherine remained quiet for most of the ride, and Yates could feel the tension in her body. Having second thoughts? He asked as they stopped to water Ranger at a stream. No, Katherine said firmly, just processing everything. It all happened so fast. Too fast? Yates asked, voicing his own concern. Katherine turned to him, her eyes clear and certain. No, not too fast, just fast. There is a difference. As the sun began to set, they finally arrived at Yates's cabin. It was exactly as he had described it, rough, isolated, and beautiful in its simplicity. Built against the side of a mountain with a clear view of the approach from below, surrounded by towering pines and overlooking a valley that stretched for miles. Yates helped Katherine down from Ranger, watching nervously as she surveyed what might become her home. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. Rough furniture that Yates had built himself, a small kitchen area, and little else. It is not much, Yates said, breaking the silence. Katherine walked slowly around the single room, running her hand along the sturdy table, examining the well-stocked shelves, looking up at the loft. Finally, she turned to him with a smile. It is honest, she said. Everything here serves a purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing false. I like it. Relief flooded through Yates. I can build additions, he said quickly. A separate bedroom, maybe a larger kitchen area. It would take time, but I could make it more comfortable for you. Katherine crossed to him and placed her hands on his chest. Yates, stop. The cabin is fine. What matters is who I am sharing it with, not how many rooms it has. Yates pulled her close, holding her tightly and breathing in the scent of her hair. I will keep you safe, he promised. Whatever happens, I will keep you safe. They spent the evening settling Katherine in and preparing a simple dinner. Yates showed her how he organized his supplies, where he kept weapons in case of emergency, and the escape routes he had planned if the cabin ever came under attack. It was grim necessity, but Katherine listened attentively, asking intelligent questions and making suggestions he had not considered. As darkness fell and they sat by the fire, Katherine spoke the question that had been hanging between them since they left Globe. What happens if Fletcher does not leave the territory? What happens if he decides to come after us here? Yates stared into the flames, considering his words carefully. Then I stop him, permanently if necessary. You mean kill him, Katherine said bluntly. If it comes to that, yes, Yates confirmed. I will not let him hurt you, Katherine. I do not care what I have to do to keep you safe. Katherine was quiet for a long moment. I do not want you to become someone you are not because of me. I do not want you to have to kill anyone because I was too stubborn to hide. Yates turned to her, taking her hands in his. Listen to me. I have killed before, during the war. It changed me, yes, but it did not make me a killer. I did what I had to do to survive, and if I have to do it again to protect you, I will. But it would not be because you were stubborn. It would be because Fletcher is a dangerous man who refuses to leave innocent people alone. Promise me something, Katherine said, her eyes intense in the firelight. Promise me that if it comes to violence, you will do everything possible to avoid it first. I do not want to be the reason you have to live with more blood on your hands. I promise, Yates said. Violence will always be the last resort. They talked late into the night, and when Katherine finally grew tired, Yates offered her the loft while he prepared to sleep by the fire. But Katherine caught his hand as he turned away. Stay with me, she said softly. Just to sleep. I do not want to be alone tonight. Yates climbed into the loft with her, and they lay together fully clothed, Katherine's head resting on his chest while his arms wrapped protectively around her. It was intimate without being improper, comfort without expectation, and Yates felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for years. I love you, Katherine whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Yates replied, the words coming easier than he had expected. Sleep now. Everything else can wait until morning. The next few days fell into a peaceful rhythm. Yates taught Katherine the routines of mountain living, how to identify animal tracks, where to find fresh water, which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Katherine proved to be a quick learner, her intelligence and practical nature serving her well in the wilderness environment. In turn, Katherine brought life to the cabin that it had never had before. She reorganized Yates's supplies with an efficiency born from years of working in the store, created meals from his basic ingredients that tasted better than anything he had made himself, and filled the space with conversation and laughter. On the fourth day, Yates took Katherine to check his trap lines, showing her the extent of his territory. They were miles from the cabin, following a game trail through dense forest. When Ranger suddenly tensed, his ears flicking forward in alert, Yates immediately pushed Katherine behind him, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his back. Someone is out there, he said quietly. They waited in tense silence until a figure emerged from the trees ahead. It was a young Apache man, probably in his early 20s, carrying a deer across his shoulders. He stopped when he saw them, his expression cautious but not hostile. Yates slowly raised his hand in greeting, then signed a message in the hand language many tribes used for intertribal communication. He had learned it during his years in the mountains, finding it useful for the occasional encounters with the various peoples who called this territory home. The Apache man studied them for a long moment, then signed back. The conversation was brief but civil, each acknowledging the other's right to hunt in this area. The young man's eyes moved to Katherine with curiosity, and Yates signed that she was his woman, making the relationship clear. The Apache signed something that made Yates smile slightly, then continued on his way, disappearing back into the forest as silently as he had appeared. "What did he say?" Katherine asked once they were alone again. "He said that a woman brave enough to live in these mountains with a white mountain man must be either very courageous or very crazy," Yates translated. "And he wished us well." Katherine laughed. "I am not sure which one I am yet, either." They returned to the cabin as afternoon faded to evening, and Yates built up the fire while Katherine prepared dinner. The domesticity of it all struck him forcefully. This was what his life could be like, what it would be like if Katherine agreed to marry him. He thought about the ring in his pack, the one James had given him, and decided that tonight was the night. They were safe, happy, and alone. There would never be a more perfect moment. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Yates cleared his throat nervously. "Katherine, there is something I want to ask you." She turned to him with a smile that faded when she saw how serious his expression was. "What is it?" Yates pulled out the small box James had given him and opened it to reveal the ring inside. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know I am asking you to give up everything you know for a hard life in these mountains, but I love you, Katherine Aldridge, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Will you marry me?" Katherine's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the ring, then at Yates. "Is that my mother's ring?" she whispered. "Your father gave it to me," Yates confirmed. "He said she would have wanted you to have it, wanted you to build a life with someone who would value you." Katherine laughed through her tears, nodding emphatically. Yes, Yates, I will marry you. I will absolutely marry you." Yates slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply. Katherine responded with equal passion, and for a long moment the world consisted of nothing but the two of them and the promise they had just made to each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Katherine touched his face gently. "I never thought I would find this," she said softly. "I had started to accept that I would spend my life helping my father run the store, maybe becoming the spinster who everyone pitied. Then you appeared in the desert like an answer to a prayer I had not even said yet." "I was existing, not living," Yates said. "You made me remember the difference. You made me want more than just surviving until the next day." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. They would return to Globe once word came that the Fletcher gang had moved on, get married properly in town with James there to give Katherine away. Then they would return to the mountains and begin building their life together. But fate, as it often does, had different plans. 3 days later, Yates was chopping firewood outside the cabin when he spotted movement in the valley below. Riders, at least 8 of them, making their way up the mountain trail toward his cabin. Even at a distance, he recognized Billy Fletcher's distinctive bay horse. "Katherine," Yates called urgently, "inside, now." She appeared in the doorway, saw the tension in his posture, and immediately moved to join him. What is it?" "Fletcher," Yates said grimly. "He found us." They watched as the riders continued their approach, clearly having tracked them from Globe. Yates mentally calculated distances and angles, trying to determine the best defensive position. The cabin was built for defense, but 8 against 1 were poor odds no matter how good the position was. "Take Ranger and go," Yates said, making the decision quickly. "Head north into the deeper mountains. There are places you can hide where they will never find you." "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," Katherine said firmly. "Katherine, please." "No," she interrupted. "You are not dying to protect me when we could both escape. We take Ranger and go together, now, before they get close enough to cut off our escape." Yates wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in Katherine's eyes, and she was right together. They had a chance. Alone, he would likely die, and then Katherine would be left unprotected anyway. "All right," he said. "Grab the emergency pack by the door. I will saddle Ranger." They moved with frantic efficiency, years of preparation paying off as Yates saddled his horse in record time and Katherine grabbed the pack containing essential supplies. Within minutes, they were riding north, using game trails and hidden paths that Yates had scouted over years of living in these mountains. Behind them, they could hear shouts as the Fletcher gang realized their quarry was escaping. Gunshots echoed through the valley, but they were too far away for accuracy. Yates pushed Ranger hard, trusting the sturdy stallion to navigate the treacherous terrain. They rode for hours, always climbing higher, going deeper into wilderness that Yates knew well, but that would be treacherous for anyone following. Finally, as darkness fell, they stopped in a small cave Yates had used before during long hunting trips. "We should be safe here for the night," Yates said, helping Katherine down from Ranger. "The cave is hidden, and the trail we used was difficult enough that they will not be able to follow it in the dark." Katherine sank onto a rock, exhausted from the long ride and the adrenaline of their escape. "Will they give up?" "Maybe," Yates said, "but Fletcher seems determined. We may have to stay out here for a while, wait for them to either lose interest or give up the search." They made a small, smokeless fire deep in the cave where the light would not be visible from outside, and ate cold provisions from the emergency pack. The temperature had dropped significantly with nightfall and altitude, and they huddled together for warmth. "I am sorry," Yates said quietly. "This is not the life I wanted to give you." Katherine turned to him, her expression fierce despite her exhaustion. "Stop apologizing for things that are not your fault. Fletcher chose to be obsessed with revenge. We chose to protect ourselves and innocent people in Globe. None of this is on you." "Still," Yates said, "running for our lives in the mountains was not exactly the romantic start to our engagement I had envisioned." Katherine laughed softly. "We are alive, we are together, and we outsmarted a gang of outlaws. I would say that is pretty romantic, in its own way." They took turns keeping watch through the night, and morning brought fresh snow that both blessed and cursed them. The snow would hide their tracks, but it also made travel more difficult and dangerous. Yates led them higher into the mountains, heading for an old mining camp he knew of that had been abandoned years earlier. For 3 days they traveled through increasingly harsh terrain, always staying ahead of the Fletcher gang, but never quite losing them entirely. Katherine proved herself remarkably tough, never complaining about the cold, the hunger, or the exhaustion. She kept up with Yates's punishing pace and remained alert even when they were both running on minimal sleep. On the 4th day, they reached the abandoned mining camp. It consisted of several partially collapsed buildings and mine shafts that had been played out and left behind. Yates led them to the most intact building, a small cabin that had served as the foreman's office. "We can rest here," he said. "The camp is remote enough that Fletcher might not know about it." They spent the day fortifying their position, blocking weak points in the walls and creating escape routes if they needed them. As evening fell, Yates finally allowed himself to relax slightly, hoping they had finally lost their pursuers. But just before dark, Ranger whinnied nervously, and Yates knew. They had been found. "How many?" Katherine asked, moving to the window beside him. Yates counted the figures emerging from the trees. 6. They must have split up to cover more ground." "What do we do?" Yates checked his rifle and pistol, ensuring both were loaded and ready. "We defend ourselves, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." Yates. "Promise me, Katherine, if things go bad, you save yourself." Katherine gripped his arm hard. "Only if you promise the same. We both survive, or neither of us does. I will not live without you." Before Yates could respond, Billy Fletcher's voice rang out across the clearing. "Younger, we know you are in there. Come out and face me like a man." Yates moved to the door, opening it just enough to shout back, "You have no quarrel with me, Fletcher. This is over a perceived insult from weeks ago. Let it go." "You made me look weak in front of my men," Billy shouted back. "That is not something I can let stand. Come out, or we come in after you and the woman." Yates felt Katherine stiffen beside him at the threat. He made a split-second decision, one born from years of combat experience and the certainty that Fletcher would not stop until someone was dead. "All right," he called out. "Just me and you, Fletcher. Man to man, fists only. You win, you let the woman go free. I win, you and your gang ride out of this territory and never come back." There was a long pause while Fletcher considered the offer. "Deal," he finally said. "But if you try anything clever, my boys will kill you and take the woman anyway." Yates turned to Katherine, memorizing her face in case this was the last time he saw her. "I love you," he said simply. "Do not you dare lose," Katherine said, tears in her eyes. "Do not you dare leave me." Yates kissed her hard, then stepped out into the clearing. Fletcher was already waiting, a cruel smile on his face. He was younger than Yates, maybe mid-20s, but he was big and clearly confident in his fighting ability. They circled each other while Fletcher's men watched from the tree line. Yates assessed his opponent, noting the way Billy held himself, looking for weaknesses. Billy struck first, a wild haymaker that Yates easily dodged. The younger man was strong but undisciplined, relying on brute force rather than technique. Yates countered with a quick jab that snapped Billy's head back, then followed with a hard right to the ribs. The fight was brutal and dirty, both men trading blows that would have dropped a lesser opponent. Yates's experience gave him an advantage, but Billy's youth and rage made him dangerous. They grappled and struck, kicked and dodged, each trying to gain the upper hand. A lucky punch from Billy caught Yates in the temple, stunning him long enough for the younger man to land several more blows. Yates felt ribs crack, tasted blood, but he refused to go down. Katherine was watching. Katherine was counting on him, and he would die before he let Fletcher win. Summoning his remaining strength, Yates caught Billy's next punch and twisted, using the younger man's momentum against him. Fletcher stumbled, and Yates followed with a devastating combination that dropped him to his knees. "Yield," Yates demanded, his voice rough. "It is over." Billy looked up with hate-filled eyes and spat blood. "Never." He lunged forward with a knife that had been hidden in his boot, a coward's move that took Yates by surprise. The blade sliced across Yates's arm, drawing blood, but Yates managed to grab Billy's wrist and twist hard. The knife fell to the ground, and Yates delivered a final punch that knocked Fletcher unconscious. Yates stood over his fallen opponent, breathing hard, his body screaming with pain. He looked up at Fletcher's men, waiting to see if they would honor the agreement. One of the older gang members stepped forward, the same one who had pulled Billy away from the store in Globe. "A deal is a deal. We will get Billy and leave the territory. You have my word." Yates nodded, not quite trusting the promise but too exhausted to do anything else. He watched as the gang members collected their unconscious leader and mounted up, riding out of the mining camp and disappearing into the trees. The moment they were out of sight, Yates's legs gave out and he collapsed. Katherine was there instantly, her hands shaking as she examined his injuries. "You're hurt badly," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to get you inside and tend to these wounds." Yates let her help him back to the cabin, every movement agony. The knife wound on his arm was deep but clean, the cracked ribs painful but not life-threatening. Katherine cleaned and bandaged his injuries with supplies from the emergency pack, her hands steady despite her fear. "You could have been killed," she said as she worked, tears streaming down her face. "But I was not," Yates replied, catching her hand and pressing it to his lips. "We are both alive, and it is over. That is what matters." They stayed at the mining camp for 3 days while Yates recovered enough to travel. Katherine cared for him with tireless devotion, and Yates found himself falling even more deeply in love with this strong, capable woman who had chosen to build a life with him. On the 4th day, they made the slow journey back to Yates's cabin, relieved to find it undisturbed. Fletcher's gang had clearly been in a hurry to catch up with them and had not bothered to destroy the place. Another week passed before Yates felt well enough to make the trip to Globe. They rode together on Ranger, Yates's arms wrapped around Katherine's waist, both of them eager to see James and put the whole ordeal behind them. Globe welcomed them like returning heroes. Word of the confrontation with the Fletcher gang had spread, and people stopped them in the street to express gratitude and admiration. Marshal Garrett confirmed that the gang had indeed left the territory, with several witnesses reporting seeing them heading east toward New Mexico. James embraced both of them with tears in his eyes, overjoyed to have his daughter back safe. When Katherine showed him her engagement ring and told him they wanted to marry as soon as possible, his joy only increased. The wedding took place 1 week later in Globe's small church. Katherine wore her mother's wedding dress, which James had carefully preserved, and Yates wore new clothes that James had insisted on buying for him. The entire town seemed to turn out for the ceremony, filling the church to capacity. As Yates watched Katherine walk down the aisle toward him, he felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced in more than a decade. This woman, this beautiful, brave, strong woman, had chosen him, had seen past the rough exterior to the man beneath, and decided he was worth loving. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told Yates he could kiss his bride, Yates pulled Katherine close and kissed her with all the love and promise he felt in his heart. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing that Yates endured with good humor despite his discomfort with crowds. But watching Katherine laugh and dance, seeing her happy and surrounded by people who cared about her, made every moment of awkwardness worthwhile. As the party finally wound down, James pulled Yates aside one last time. "Take care of her," he said, the same words he had spoken before, but with new meaning now that they were officially family. "Always," Yates promised. "I will spend every day of my life making sure she is happy and safe." "I know you will," James said. "And Yates, thank you for giving me back my daughter's smile. I had not seen her truly happy like this since her mother died." The next morning, Yates and Katherine began the journey back to the mountain cabin, this time as husband and wife. Katherine rode behind Yates on Ranger, her arms wrapped around his waist and her head resting against his broad back. "Are you ready for this?" Yates asked as the cabin came into view. "The reality of mountain life, day after day." "I am ready for a life with you," Katherine replied. "Everything else is just details." The first year of their marriage was full of adjustments and learning. Katherine adapted to mountain life with remarkable resilience, learning to hunt, trap, and preserve food for the long winters. Yates built additions to the cabin as he had promised, creating a proper bedroom and expanding the kitchen area. They made trips to Globe every few months, Katherine helping her father with the store for a week or two before returning to the mountains with Yates. It was a good balance, allowing Katherine to maintain her relationship with her father while building her new life as a mountain wife. In the spring of 1880, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Yates with a joy he had never expected to feel, along with a terror he had not known was possible. The closest doctor was 20 miles away in Globe, and mountain winters could make travel impossible. "We should stay in Globe for the birth," Yates insisted when Katherine was 6 months along. "It is too dangerous to be this far from help." But Katherine refused. "This is our home, Yates. Our child should be born here, in the mountains you love and the cabin we built together." In the end, they compromised. They arranged for an experienced midwife from Globe to come stay with them for the last month of Katherine's pregnancy, ensuring someone knowledgeable would be present for the birth. On a cold November evening in 1880, exactly 2 years after Yates had first found Katherine stranded in the desert, their son was born. The labor was difficult, and there were moments when Yates feared he would lose both Katherine and the baby. But Katherine was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known, and just after midnight, a healthy baby boy entered the world with a cry that echoed through the mountain cabin. Yates held his son with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the fragile perfection of the tiny human he and Katherine had created. "He is perfect," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He is ours," Katherine said from the bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not been able to decide. Now, looking at his newborn son, Yates knew exactly what the boy's name should be. "James," he said, "after your father, James Younger." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. "He would be so honored. Yes, James, that is perfect." Raising a child in the mountains proved both harder and more rewarding than either of them had imagined. Young James was a healthy, curious boy who seemed to have inherited his father's love for the wilderness and his mother's quick intelligence. By the time he was 2, he could identify animal tracks and name the trees around their cabin. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Winters were spent mostly in the cabin, with Yates teaching James about the land and Katherine continuing to manage their household with the efficiency she had learned in her father's store. Springs and summers were busier, with hunting, trapping, and trips to Globe to trade and visit James Aldridge, who doted on his grandson with undisguised affection. In 1883, Katherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Evelyn after Katherine's mother. The birth was easier than James's had been, and Evelyn proved to be a calm, observant baby who rarely cried. Yates often found himself stopping in the middle of daily tasks, overcome with gratitude for the life he had been given. The lonely mountain man who had existed rather than lived had been transformed into a husband and father with a family he loved more than he had thought possible. One evening in the fall of 1884, as they sat around the dinner table with their 2 children, Katherine caught Yates's eye and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" "Just remembering the day I found you in the desert," Yates said. "How I almost rode past, figured it was none of my business." "Why did you stop?" Katherine asked. It was a question she had never asked before, and Yates considered it carefully. "I told myself it was because any decent man would help someone in trouble," he said slowly. "But looking back, I think maybe I was meant to find you that day, like something bigger than both of us knew we needed each other." Katherine reached across the table and took his hand. "I think you were right. I think we were always meant to find each other, to build this life together." Young James, now 4 years old, looked between his parents with a confused expression. "Mama was lost?" "Yes, sweet pea," Katherine said with a smile. "My horse got hurt and I was stranded very far from home, but your father found me, gave me his horse, and walked beside me all the way back to town." "That's a long walk," James said seriously, making both his parents laugh. "Yes, it was," Yates confirmed, "but it was worth every step." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. James grew into a strong, capable boy who could track game and handle a rifle with the same skill his father had at that age. Evelyn developed her mother's sharp mind and her father's love for the wilderness, often accompanying Yates on his rounds of the traplines. In 1887, tragedy struck when James Aldridge passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68. Katherine was devastated by the loss of her father, and Yates held her through the long nights as she grieved. They discussed moving to Globe permanently to take over the store, but Katherine ultimately decided to sell it to a young couple who had recently arrived in town looking to establish themselves. "My life is here now," she told Yates as they stood on the porch of their mountain cabin, watching their children play in the meadow below. "With you, with our family." Father understood that. He told me once that the greatest gift a parent can give their child is permission to build their own life, even if it is different from what the parent had envisioned. The money from selling the store allowed them to make significant improvements to the cabin. Yates built a proper second story, creating separate bedrooms for the children and a larger workspace for Katherine, who had begun writing down stories of their life in the mountains. She had no plans to publish them, but she wanted her children and eventual grandchildren to know the story of how their family began. In 1889, when James was 9 and Evelyn was 6, Katherine discovered she was pregnant again. The third pregnancy was more difficult than the first two, and at 33 years old, Katherine felt every one of her years. But in the spring of 1890, they welcomed another son, whom they named Yates Younger. "Now we have one of each and one more for good measure," Katherine joked as she nursed the newborn. "Our family is complete." Yates looked at his wife, still beautiful despite the silver beginning to thread through her blonde hair, and at his 3 children, healthy and happy. "More than complete," he said. "Perfect." The turn of the century brought changes to the territory. Arizona was growing, with more settlers arriving and the railroad connecting previously isolated communities. The Wild West that Yates had known was slowly being tamed, but in the high mountains, their life remained much the same. Young James left home in 1895 at the age of 15 to attend school in Tucson, wanting to become a teacher. Yates was initially resistant to the idea, worried about his son leaving the security of the mountains, but Katherine convinced him to let James follow his own path. "He has your strength and my practicality," she said. "He will be fine. And besides, we raised him to think for himself. We cannot be upset when he does exactly that." James returned home during summers, bringing books and stories of the changing world beyond the mountains. He was a natural teacher, patient and enthusiastic, and watching him with his younger siblings made Yates proud of the man his son was becoming. Evelyn showed no interest in leaving the mountains, instead becoming her father's constant shadow. She could outshoot most men, track game in any weather, and had a deep understanding of the wilderness that impressed even Yates. She talked of becoming a hunting guide, leading wealthy city people into the mountains for sport. Yates Jr., the baby of the family, was quieter than his siblings, but just as capable. He loved working with his hands, building and fixing things with a natural aptitude that reminded Katherine of her father. In 1902, as Yates approached his 54th birthday and Katherine her 46th, they found themselves alone in the cabin for the first time in over 20 years. James was teaching at a school in Phoenix, Evelyn had indeed become a hunting guide and was away on an expedition, and Yates Jr. was staying with friends in Globe for a few weeks. Strange, is it not? Katherine said, sitting beside Yates on the porch as they watched the sun set over the mountains. Just the two of us again. Takes me back to our first days here, Yates replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. Though we are both a bit older and grayer now, Katherine laughed, leaning into his embrace. Do you ever regret it? This life, so far from everything? Never, Yates said immediately. You gave me everything I did not know I needed. Family, purpose, a reason to wake up each morning beyond simple survival. These have been the best years of my life, Katherine. Mine too, she said softly. I was so scared that day in the desert when Daisy broke her leg. I thought I was going to die out there alone. And then you appeared. This big, rough mountain man who gave up his horse and walked beside me all the way home. Best decision I ever made, Yates said, walking beside you home that day, and every day since. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the sounds of the mountain night rising around them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled and an owl called from the trees. It was the symphony Yates had listened to for decades, but now it was even sweeter because he shared it with the woman he loved. In 1905, James married a fellow teacher, a smart, kind woman named Sarah, who fit into the family as if she had always belonged. They gave Yates and Katherine their first grandchildren, twin girls, in 1906. Evelyn married in 1908, choosing a rancher named Thomas, who respected her independence and supported her work as a hunting guide. Their wedding took place in the mountain meadow below the cabin, with half of Globe in attendance. Yates Jr. took over managing the family property, building his own cabin nearby, and starting a business making custom furniture that became highly sought after throughout the territory. He married a quiet woman named Margaret in 1910, and they too began adding grandchildren to the growing family. As Yates and Katherine entered their 60s, they finally began to slow down. Yates's joints ached on cold mornings, and Katherine's eyesight was not what it once had been. But they were healthy and happy, surrounded by children and grandchildren who visited regularly. On a cool November evening in 1918, exactly 40 years after Yates had found Katherine stranded in the desert, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with their entire family. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren filled the expanded cabin to capacity. As Yates looked around at the family he and Katherine had created, he felt overwhelming gratitude for the twist of fate that had led him to a stranded woman with a lame horse all those years ago. He had given her his horse and walked beside her home, never imagining that the journey would last a lifetime. Katherine caught him staring and smiled, the same smile that had captured his heart 4 decades earlier. She raised her glass in a silent toast, and Yates did the same, acknowledging the love and life they had built together. Young James stood to make a speech, his teacher's voice carrying easily over the gathered family. 40 years ago, my father made a choice that changed all of our lives. He could have ridden past the woman whose horse had gone lame. He could have pointed her toward town and continued on his way. Instead, he gave her his horse and walked beside her home. That single act of kindness and selflessness is the foundation of this entire family. He raised his glass higher. To my parents, who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every single day. To 40 years of choosing each other, no matter what challenges life brought, may we all be lucky enough to find a love that lasts a lifetime. The toast was echoed throughout the cabin, and Yates felt tears prick his eyes. He pulled Katherine close, kissing her temple as their family celebrated around them. I love you, he whispered in her ear. Every single day, I choose you. And I always will. I love you too, Katherine replied. My mountain man who walked beside me home and never left my side. Every day I'm grateful I walked into your life. As the celebration continued into the night, Yates felt a deep sense of completion. His life, which had seemed so broken and empty all those years ago, had been made whole by the love of a good woman and the family they had built together. The lonely mountain man who had existed rather than lived was gone, replaced by a husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather whose life was rich with love and purpose. The mountains were still his home, still the place where he felt most at peace. but now they were also Catherine's home, and their children's home, and their grandchildren's home. The legacy they had built would continue long after they were gone, a testament to the power of a single choice made on a desert trail 40 years earlier. As the last guests finally departed and quiet returned to the cabin, Yates and Katherine sat together by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder and his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "A good night," Katherine murmured sleepily. "A good life," Yates corrected, "and it is not over yet. We have many more years together if I have anything to say about it." Katherine smiled and squeezed his hand. "Then we better make them count. What should we do with all this time?" "The same thing we have always done," Yates replied. "Wake up each morning, work hard, love each other, and appreciate the gift of another day together. It is a simple life, but it is ours." "Perfect," Katherine said softly. "Absolutely perfect." They sat together until the fire burned low. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from a chance encounter in the desert. The mountain man who had given up his horse and walked a stranded woman home had found his home in return, and that home was wherever Katherine was. As they finally climbed the stairs to bed, Yates looked back at the cozy cabin filled with evidence of their life together. Pictures on the walls, furniture crafted by their son, blankets sewn by Katherine, rifles and traps that had fed their family for decades. Every item told a story, every corner held a memory. "Thank you," he said suddenly, making Katherine pause on the stairs. "For what?" she asked. "For trusting me that day in the desert, for choosing this life, for giving me a family, for making me whole again, for everything." Katherine turned and cupped his weathered face in her soft hands. "You saved my life that day, Yates Younger, and then you spent the next 40 years making that life worth living. I am the one who should be thanking you." "Then we will call it even," Yates said with a smile, "and spend whatever time we have left continuing to save each other, one day at a time." They continued up to bed, where they had slept side by side for 40 years, and would continue to sleep side by side for whatever years remained. Two people who had found each other when they needed it most, who had chosen love over fear, who had built a life in the wild mountains of Arizona that was as strong and enduring as the peaks themselves. The mountain man and the storekeeper's daughter, bound together by a lame horse and a long walk home, living proof that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the simplest acts of kindness. And they lived those lives together, surrounded by family and love, until they were both very old. When Yates finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, with Katherine's hand in his last words were, "Best walk of my life." Katherine lived 3 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and when she joined Yates, she was buried beside him in the mountain meadow where they had built their life together. On her tombstone, beside her name and dates, were the words she had requested, "He walked beside me home, and I stayed forever." Their children and grandchildren continued to live in and around the mountains, carrying on the legacy of strength, kindness, and love that Yates and Katherine had established. The original cabin remained in the family, lovingly maintained and expanded over the years, a testament to the love story that had begun with a stranded woman, a lame horse, and a mountain man who chose kindness over convenience. And in the quiet moments, when the mountain wind whispered through the pines and the sun set golden over the peaks, those who knew the story could almost see them. Yates and Katherine, walking together through the wilderness they loved, still choosing each other, still making their long walk home together. The end of one journey, but the beginning of a legacy that would endure for generations, all because a mountain man once gave his horse to a stranded woman and walked beside her, not knowing that he was walking toward his destiny, toward love, toward home.